Hello friends, and welcome to UK Net Zero Action. Now hopefully mapping the start of what is to be our big adventure into a renewable future. Last month in Westminster, while the Prime Minister was busily backtracking on his plans for net zero, a mile away at the heart of British science, the Royal Institution, something quite extraordinary was being demonstrated. It was as if a big key was being turned in a lock, a giant door being opened, and suddenly we were given the way to harvest all the offshore power we need to achieve net zero. In technical terms, obviously, it is a lot more complicated, but we'll get to that in a minute. However, it certainly is ironic that at the very moment we're starting to back away from net zero, at that ancient, venerable bastion of British science, the key to our future was being turned, and to my great surprise, this appears to have been entirely overlooked by the press. So what is this extraordinary overlooked key? Well, it is a technological breakthrough, the one that provides the long-awaited news that we do now possess the means to achieve net zero with offshore wind, and we might even get there sooner if we get our act together. The path to net zero is now open and clear, it seems, and by the way, it's all good, but its logic can actually be surprising. And so welcome to UK Net Zero Action. My name is Richard Julius Gillespie, and in this bi-weekly series I will be developing the inevitable logic of how we must develop this breakthrough into a practical net zero and so secure our future. It is quite simply the path before us that we must now take. But first, please hit the like and subscribe buttons so you can follow along to monitor our progress over the coming months, rather than just having to rely on the government's spin. It's free to you, as I am now retired and doing this as a public service. In this first edition, I explain why it is now clear what we're going to get in the way of renewable power, and so I can trace the manifest logic of an energy system almost entirely based on wind power through to its natural conclusion, mapping out the implications. It's all good, thankfully. It's much better than nuclear, which we cannot get on time, although we certainly could use more. It is real, unlike nuclear fusion, which has been a promising new technology for the past 30 years, but never seems to arrive, and there is no known timeline for that. By contrast, offshore wind is real, it is cheap, and by the way, over time, it will immensely enrich us all. No longer will we import expensive foreign oil and gas, sometimes from hostile regimes, and all that is going to be good for us here and everywhere. You should know, in my work as a supervisory analyst in financial research with global institutions for 35 years, I had to qualify in various different areas, including economics, and as a result, I bring much more of a bird's eye view to this project than our engineers, who are wont to see it only as a series of technical issues, or politicians who are always constrained in their policies by their need for support. And that is what I bring to this, along with the fact that I have no self-interest other than to survive and see my grandchildren live long and happily too. To achieve net zero, we must obviously take all these concerns on board, and others, mainly commercial, but as I show, the economic considerations must come first, as this is to be the biggest industrial transition in our history. This project will require the unity of purpose and detailed planning we only seem to find when at war, but happily not the personal sacrifice. But now we have finally a practical means to achieve net zero. Let's look at what that is. It begins with offshore wind turbines, which we have had for about 15 years. So what's changed? Well, it's something which at first glance seems fairly minor in the fantastical world of floating wind turbines. Yes, floating. It's about floating something that could be 100 meters tall and keeping it stable and standing proud to reap the wind in all weathers at sea. It is awesome new technology and testimony to man's unflagging ingenuity. Several such wind farms already exist right here off our coast, including the very first one, Hywind in Scotland. However, compared to fixed base turbines, they are very expensive, still too expensive, in fact, owing to the high cost involved in anchoring them to the seabed. So it was only a few weeks ago that Susan Gorvanek, Professor of Geotechnical Engineering at the Universities of Southampton and Cambridge, a leading consultant and expert on offshore engineering, demonstrated this breakthrough. As a chair of emerging technologies in this field at the Royal Institution, she was presenting the findings of her recent investigation into seabed anchoring systems. In this study, she was tasked to find out whether there could be a more economical way to anchor these floating wind turbines. Short of a miracle in which we achieve nuclear fusion, our best chance of reaching net zero in the northern climes actually hinges on this. In global terms, 80% of the wind potential is out in this deeper water, and so these seabed systems are also critical to the plans for floating wind turbines off the coast of the US in California, maybe the East Coast in Japan, Korea, China, France, and in many other places. So in net zero terms, this is a global breakthrough, in fact. And it is also of critical importance in the UK, because here we are blessed with some of the windiest weather on Earth, enough even to supply all our energy needs many times over. But on our little island, there just isn't enough space available for the wind farms onshore. So it is no accident that since offshore wind first emerged as a practical alternative, we have led the world in its development. And over the past 5 years, offshore wind has contributed by far most of the growth in our renewable capacity. Today, our 3,000 offshore wind turbines pump out as much energy as our smaller 12,000 onshore wind turbines, together amounting to about 28 gigawatts, 25% of our total electrical generation capacity. But we need a lot more, because fossil fuels still provide 40% of our electrical power generation. And of course, we need a whole lot more electricity for EVs, not to mention heating, many other applications, especially in industry. So if the government wants 10 times as much wind power, we can't get all that in the shallower waters off our coastline. Those areas are already busy with shipping lanes, wildlife protected areas, fishing grounds, Department of Defence restricted zones, oil and gas terminals, and planned and existing wind turbine farms, among other things. So bottom line, to get all our renewable power, we need to go further out to sea, to depths of 60 meters or more, where we can get it, several times over if necessary. But that is too deep to build fixed turbines on the seabed. Out there, we must literally float them, such as with the Hywind towers of Scotland. But to float high above the waves in all weathers, the Hywind towers are stabilised by spar buoys, which are like massive floating bottles made of concrete and steel. They float above and below the waterline. They weigh from 2,000 to 6,000 tons, and they carry the turbine tower aloft. They are secured to the seabed with massive steel mooring lines attached to giant anchors, piles or caissons, which are like upside-down buckets sunk into the seabed. Naturally, with all this additional engineering, floating wind turbines are considerably more expensive to build than the fixed offshore variety. Sure, the technology is developing rapidly, and today floating wind turbines are more likely to be built on platforms than on spar buoys, as that is much more economical and efficient, and the costs are coming down, but it's still too expensive. However, it is by no means a hopeless case. The potential is there for very considerable cost savings. For example, apart from solar, wind power, especially on land, is the cheapest form of electricity. Land-based wind farms have provided power to the grid at just £35 per megawatt hour, which is 3.5p per kilowatt hour, and fixed-base wind turbines also produce good value energy at around £65 per megawatt hour, or 6.5p per kilowatt to the grid. The additional cost arising from the need to fix and sink their fixed foundations into the seabed is expensive. Floating wind turbines cost more than twice that, yet offshore wind farms, both fixed and floating, do also catch more wind, a lot more wind, and they catch it more reliably at sea and at more useful times, such as in the afternoon. So their higher cost is partially offset by their greater size and height, because the mathematics of wind power very much favours bigger and taller. For example, a turbine with a windswept radius of 85 metres produces about 5 megawatts of power, but one with a 130 metre radius can produce more than 3 times that at 18 megawatts. Also, a wind turbine spinning in a wind blowing at 12 miles per hour generates only half as much electricity as one in a wind blowing at only 3 miles per hour faster, at 15 miles per hour. And if the wind speed doubles, you get 8 times as much energy. All of this is only to say that at sea we can get huge amounts of power, and all the power we need for net zero, but it comes with massive anchoring costs, which makes floating wind turbines the most expensive wind power of all, at about £160 per megawatt hour, or 16p per kilowatt hour currently, which is too much to support their use on the massive scale we require. So we have to get the cost down somehow, and that is what Professor Gorvanek and her team went to find out. They did not come back empty-handed, thankfully. What they found are some peculiar seabed characteristics she calls the seabed superpowers. With that natural phenomenon, along with some technical innovations and a few ingenious devices they tested, she's concluded, and here please note I'm paraphrasing her, that we can indeed float wind turbines more economically, much more economically, even on the massive scale we require to achieve net zero here in the UK. And further, she has identified a new undeveloped area of sea of 100,000 square kilometres around our island, enough anchorage to accommodate all those wind turbines we should need, both for our own use and to export power, plus, and this is the really astonishing news, even enough to satisfy our need for green hydrogen, not just as the missing fuel we might need for trains, aeroplanes and ships, but also as the critical missing long-term energy storage medium, the lack of which has been pressing our government into making plans to build 8 more nuclear power stations. In summing up her presentation, Professor Gorvanek said, and I quote, "So we have seen various innovations to improve anchor performance to deliver collective offshore wind ambitions at the pace and scale required to meet net zero targets." And to this, she added a plea to the government to establish a fleet of special but smallish boats to immediately set about mapping the seabed with special equipment designed for this purpose, saying it is an essential focus for innovation to acquire the parameters for the engineering design at the pace and scale required. So let me repeat that. Following her investigation, Professor Gorvanek concludes that we now have the tools, the technical understanding and sufficient space offshore to float an army, or should I say navy, of giant wind turbines to fulfill our net zero objective. And in her presentation, see here, she demonstrated how we can fix all these turbines more cheaply, but still safely, with steel anchors of only half the size or less we currently make them. Potential savings of around half the current seabed anchor costs. This is achieved with a new type of caisson, the size of a small house, that is vacuum sucked into the seabed through pressure lines. Moreover, after 6 months, the team found that anchor strength doubles. Extraordinary, and astonishingly, it continues to strengthen throughout its entire life. And since we could need 100,000 such caissons, it is critical that they can now be made only half the size, and that floating turbines can share them. Now that we can supply the foundations much more cheaply, we can supply the turbines more economically and without straining our resources or creating any more CO2 than is strictly necessary. And she also raised the prospect we can make further savings by building fewer, bigger wind turbines to mobilize that highly favourable wind power equation mentioned earlier. And so, in short, this revelation could see the beginning of an end to our long-standing net zero indecision. And please see here for her full lecture on YouTube. Moreover, consider this. By gearing up to achieve net zero this way with wind turbines, we will soon be making more of our wind turbines with the power from the wind turbines we have already made, so eventually achieving a virtually zero carbon manufacturing process as the number of turbines increases. We can do this because the wind farm installation cycle is only 5 to 6 years, whereas the timeline to build a nuclear power station is more like 20 years. So if we did set out on an exclusively nuclear path to net zero, we would have to achieve it using fossil fuels for the next 20 years. With offshore wind, the amount of fossil fuels used diminishes with each 5 to 6 year cycle to eventually disappear altogether. I will reveal all these virtues and complications in my next presentation. Now we can, how we can. But to give you a clue based on official government statistics of our energy consumption, my calculations confirm it can be done if matched by 2 large energy storage systems. The one is batteries, the subject of my 3rd episode, and the other is green hydrogen, which I will discuss in my 2nd episode, along with my calculations of how many wind turbines we would need to do the job. Until then, please hit the like and subscribe buttons, and above all, accept that now we know we can achieve net zero in this way. We have no choice but to do it. And if we do it this way, the way Professor Gorvanek suggests, we should be able to move forward to secure our future. And the best news of all, it will not cost the Earth. And when it does, here in the UK, we will become both a more affluent and a less embattled society. So until next time, my next episode, please stay safe and remember that now we can secure our future.